Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Thought we'd talk a little bit about the problems Iran is having with the Israelis. It's in my mind, quite humorous, but I don't think the Iranians see it quite the same way, Jim.
No, and actually, there's something else going on there. It's not just all the things going boom, especially the facilities related to their nuclear and ballistic missile programs. The fact is that Iran is falling apart. I mean, the decades of sanctions have hurt the economy. That plus the corruption among the ruling, the religious leaders, the religious dictatorship, as I call it, which has been bringing out the crowds. In fact, they've executed 11 of the protesters so far, as an example, but the protests continue. Somebody else, I think, did an analysis and showed that last year they were having a large number of things going boom, major accidents, as it were. But none of them were in the nuclear and missile facilities, which get all the money they need. It's the rest of the economy that is going boom for lack of maintenance and what have you. Their commercial airlines crash all the time, so of course do their military aircraft. And what the government is trying to do is not admit that all these explosions and what have you are normal, which they are in many cases, in most cases, but they're still sulking, as it were, about the way we killed their head of their IRGC, General Soleimani, in January, along with a few of his key Iraqi aides, as it were, the head of the local Hezbollah, the Iraqi Hezbollah. And they've not recovered from that. And in fact, I just did a Iraq update this week, and they are having more problems. It's getting worse, and it's coming to a head because they're pulling out all the stops in Iraq, fearful that they're going to be tossed out. They keep asking for the Americans to leave. The Americans want to leave. The Iraqis don't want them to leave, but they want the Iranians to get out. So Iran really can't say what is really happening. They're trying to spin this, sounds like American politics. They're trying to spin it in a direction that will make them look like the victim and basically blame it on Israel, which they do for most things to go wrong. But the Iranians have figured it out. Most of the things going wrong in Iran are the fault of their religious dictatorship and not Israel. Now, Israel is striking back. We've written that up several times on our strategy page. Iranian hackers were found poking around in the Israeli utilities systems. And the Israelis later found out that was part of a larger program to try and disrupt the Israeli support system, military support system for wartime. That is closely integrated with the civilian economy. And it's well protected as far as these things go. But the Iranians have been making a very, strong effort to make some headway there. They got caught. And now the Israelis are striking back in many ways that we don't hear about. I mean, there have been some instances where the Israelis have been making attacks on other, how should I put it, friends of Iran, and making it look like it's Iranian hackers. Which, again, the Iranians have to explain. Well, we're not competent enough to prevent that sort of thing, and it really isn't us, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't talk about that either. So there is basically a cyber war going on between Israel and Iran, which is complicated by the fact that the religious dictatorship is under siege, as it were, under attack by their own population for all the problems that the religious dictatorship has caused, which are catching up because the religious rulers have been in charge since the 1980s, and they have not improved things.
So, Austin, how do you see things going there?
Look, very similar to Jim. Jim's done given you a really good, succinct description of what the Iranian dictatorship, the religious dictatorship, has caused, and now what it faces. Let's just go through a couple of places. The action continues in Syria. The Iranians had said that they were going to improve, and we had something on strategy page about this. Jim wrote about it. Iran was going to improve Syria's, meaning Assad's air defenses. But as pointed out in that update, Iran lacks the technical capability to build a first-rate, even second-rate air defense in Syria. And at the same time, when the Iranians have all their technicians in there and have their various operatives, they get killed by 2 or 3 different factions. And if they're found to be conniving with Lebanese Hezbollah or the like, and plotting an attack on Israel, suddenly the bombs go off, or the planes show up, and the Iranians lose another, not just manpower. The Israelis, there was an article I read, now this was 2 months ago. The thinking is that at least 25 Iranian, I shouldn't say thinking, the evidence was 25 Iranian logistics dumps or depots had been hit by Israeli airstrikes or even missile strikes since the end of 2019, and that was in Syria. In other words, the weapons depots and ammunition dumps, in some cases, some of these technical sites where they've left, equipment for radars, communications, and the like. Okay, Iraq. They've lost a lot of support within Iraq. Jim already talked about the fact that the U.S. wants out. The Iraqis, most of the real Iraqis, want a U.S. presence, armed presence, to remain. But Iran doesn't have the money to spend on Iraq anymore, on pumping up the popular Mujahideen militias, the pro-Iranian militias that have so plagued Iraq. He doesn't have the money to throw around anymore. They're still locked in Yemen, and they've got internal issues. Now, I've talked about their exported wars, but their own internal issues. And Jim mentioned the domestic. Let's start with water. There's still in June, there were still 5 major Iranian cities, actually regions, that were suffering from severe water problems. What is the issue there? Well, decayed infrastructure. That goes back, as Jim pointed out, the Ayatollahs have been in charge really since, 1979, but definitely since 81, when Bani Sadr was the first elected president, was overthrown by the Ayatollahs and exiled. So now they're responsible for that lack of maintenance. It's certainly contributed to, Wuhan virus. I know it's supposed to call it COVID-19, Wuhan or Chinese Communist Party virus, what it is. That's just savaged Iran. Now, there are various figures out there. I've seen, I think the one we had up on strategy page, fatalities, was between 12 and 13,000, but there's some suggestions, indications that that's grossly underreported, maybe by a factor of 150%. In other words, you're looking at 30,000 deaths in Iran. How many illnesses? We don't really know. But degradation of water facilities, degradation of medical facilities. Yeah, it's the medicine's really good for the nomenclatura and the Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Pasad Iran, and for the elites of the dictatorship. But Iran in 1979, when the Shah's regime fell, had comparatively in the region a good medical facilities, reasonable national health care. That doesn't exist. When I say a level of being able to provide medicine and pharmaceuticals and medical care to most of the population, with the exception of some of the poor and more remote areas, but certainly in the cities. That's not the case now, Dan. Everybody's seen it degrade over time, and that's been one of the accelerators on why Iran was one of the first places savaged by the Chinese virus. Last thing I'm going to say too: the sanctions have bit. Jim mentioned that. I'm talking about U.S. economic sanctions with the end of that absolutely ridiculous nuclear deal that the Obama administration promulgated, and the regime has real problems with finances and also accessing the banks throughout the world. So what are they doing? Well, we reported on this is that there was a leak that Iran and China were about to sign a big long-term deal, and the leaks. It was pretty clear that Iran was trying to get China to step up and give them a heck of a lot of money. Well, today, the day we're recording this, there is a detailed report on Voice of America on this deal that has now, there's plenty of evidence for it. And Iran has asking China, and China seems to be inclined to do it, because it's another way to buy and purchase an ally. Well, $400 billion investment, primarily, of course, in Iranian oil and natural gas. The irony on this is absolutely bitter, because the Chinese Communist Party regime, one of the worst of its crimes against humanity is what they've done to the Uyghurs, the Muslims out in northwestern China. And here it is, this Islamic revolutionary regime is butting up with the Chinese dictatorship, butting up to the tune of $400 billion. Now, is that going to work? Who knows? But that is really a sign of the extraordinary desperation that the regime is under. Now, to take this back to the explosions that you mentioned. Yes, there have been a number of explosions at nuclear-related laboratories, also in a couple of places that are potentially related to nuclear weapons fabrication. But one of the more interesting, now those were the explosions, one of the more interesting cyber operations in which the Israelis owned up to. And I believe, Jim, you had this in that July 14th report you had, was at one of our major ports. They hacked the control machines, both for the containers, for the containers, and also you have to bring trucks and unload, offload, and the like. And for 2 or 3 days at least, there was a huge traffic jam getting into and out of the port because they weren't able to move the containers. They weren't able to communicate. And of course, you've got this big line of 18-wheelers stretching how far, who knows. But the point was, the Israelis showed that they could do it. And was it tit for tat? Because the Iranians have certainly tried to hack Israel. They made a big deal out of last year, and then I believe again this year, that they were trying to hack into Israel's grid. I don't know if that came off. Jim might know.
They got close. They
got close.
They were poking around a water supply system, a local water supply system.
So the Israelis sent them a message. And is that an explosion? I think it counts as an explosion. shows you what they can, their capabilities of absolutely tying up a critical port that with a regime that's already running out of money, running out of medicine, running out of food, and has, as I said, at least 5 regions that are having water problems. Doesn't look good, Dan.
Yeah. Jim, on the Israeli side, I guess the Iranians have been wanting to wipe them off the face of the earth and that. And I think the Israelis have slowly but quietly gone about, making sure that the Iranians aren't going to be able to do this, correct?
Yes, the Israelis' long-range plan is to go back to the pre-79 situation where the Iran and Israel were basically friends. I mean, they traded, they exchanged intelligence information, et cetera, et cetera. The Israelis tried to warn the Shah about the problem he was going to have with the Shia religious leaders who were sitting in exile in Paris, from whence they made all these. They took advantage of the how should I put it, media warfare at the time, which consisted of making audio cassettes and sneaking them back into Iraq, into Iran. Of course, now it's all the internet, and the Israelis have more control over that than they ever had over any earlier media. What the Israelis don't want to do, which they are being forced to do, is show their hand. For example, that hack into the largest container port in Iran was something they were saving for an emergency. Now they have to redo that because the Iranians are, closing some of the vulnerabilities that the Israelis were exploiting. So the Israelis, at great expense, I don't know how much it costs, probably a couple $100,000, to basically develop a new attack plan. As the old saying goes, defeat teaches you more than victory. The Israelis are acutely aware that they learned a lesson in '73 when they got a bad case of the victory disease, and the Egyptians, humiliated them for a few days. When they say never forget, they're not just talking about the Nazis. Now they're talking about their own hubris. And that's something we report on regularly. It's out in the Israeli media and what have you. But the Israelis do have a large arsenal of attacks which they have not used, and that makes the Iranians, nervous. Now, normally, a country that's in that situation would forget about the offensive operations and spend much more effort on the defensive operations. But that does not seem to be happening. I mean, the Iranians are still trying to poke around. They have to have a victory. That's what it comes down to. The government, as Austin pointed out, has been pushing this, destroy Israel. Well, they're moving in reverse. The Israelis are destroying them. Not only that, in the most horrible of developments, the Israelis are now friends, soon to be diplomatic friends, so to speak, officially, with most of the Arab Gulf states. Now, the Iranians thought that would never happen. Well, never say never, because now it's happening. I mean, the Arabs finally realized, those Iranians, we always hated them because they're Indo-European, but these Jews, they're Semites. We're Semites. Let's all us Semites get together and beat the crap out of these Indo-European Persians, and that's something that's the worst nightmare for the Iranians, because they thought they could always rely on the hate the Arabs had developed for decades against Israel. Well, the Arabs are now pushing back. Now that's hard, and that's hurting them domestically, but they're doing it. Journalists are saying good things about Israel and state-controlled and independent media, especially in Saudi Arabia. The quiet negotiations, they're already exchanging information on terrorism and what have you. The Israelis have been extremely useful and have saved the Arabs a lot of problems, by tipping them off to something the Iranians are up to. This is basically the Iranians showing, look, this is what happens when all us Semites work together. And that is slowly but surely swaying, most Arabs, because the Arab governments for decades they push this hate, and that basically has a long-term effect. Kids, generations are raised, blaming everything on Israel, and all of a sudden Israel is our friend. They say, what? I mean, basically, they're putting their own domestic, political power at risk and taking a lot of heat domestically. But most Arabs realize that Iran is a major threat, and the Iranians proved that when they made that drone, quadcopter cruise missile attack on a Saudi oil facility and cut Saudi oil shipments for about 10-20% for a few days. That basically hit them in the paybook.
Yeah, let me make a. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I want to make a comment about that because I'm glad you brought it up. I was going to, if you didn't. The Saudis were very surprised by that, and of course, analysis came back that the Iranians had used a kind of a circuitous route that some of those drones were launched out of Iran. The Israelis supposedly, over the years, and I believe it to be the truth, had been telling the Saudis, we can help you with air defenses. We can help you. We can help provide you should you be attacked by someone else. And the Saudis are aware of it. I think they were already making deals with the Israelis, and of course we're there too with our surveillance. But I think that brought it home to them. That,
yes,
that I really do think that attack on that huge refinery complex was a learning experience, not just for the Saudi government, but for everybody in Saudi Arabia and for a lot of the Arab coast, the Gulf Arab states.
In fact, even before that attack, the UAE, who may have been listening to the Israelis, more diligently than the Saudis. The UAE is a collection, as we've described it many times, of independent states, United Arab Emirates, and they have always been more forward-looking. In fact, the UAE has a better clean government rating than the Israelis by a few points, which I thought was humorous. Because as many Israelis have said, we're turning into a Middle Eastern country. Be that as it may, the Emirates, the UAE, with the exception of Qatar, but that's another story, have basically been always in touch with the Israelis.
Absolutely, I was going to say that because of the trading mentality that of at least two of the Emirates there in the UAE, they were in touch with them both at finance and trade levels. I didn't mean to interrupt on that.
Yeah, but the UAE is also showing the Israelis that the oil is running out. The Emirates never had as much oil as the Israelis. They always had to depend more on trading. Dealing with others. In fact, the Emirates only survived by making deals with foreigners, usually non-Muslims. They were threatened by the Turks. They were threatened by the Persians. They were threatened by the Saudis. And they basically our major naval bases and air bases are, some are in Saudi Arabia, the air bases, but mainly they're in the Emirates. So the Emirates know who their friends are. The founder of the Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz bin Saud.
Abdulaziz ibn Saud.
Yeah, he basically said that outright. He says, make friends with the Americans. They are far away. And they basically don't have the track record of walking all over the Arabs like everybody else does. And we've basically held to that. And that is one reason why they're willing to go with the Israelis, because they notice the Americans always sided with the Israelis. They're like these clever Emiratis. They know where the real power is, and we're only basically hurting ourselves. And of course, the Saudis also note that the American Patriot system has saved them from a lot of embarrassment, because they've stopped all the ballistic missiles the Iranians have been firing from Yemen, and of course blaming it on the Yemen, Shia rebels. And of course the Israelis come in and say, look, we co-developed air defense systems with the Americans, not the Patriot, although some of the later improvements in the Patriot came with some Israeli input. But they have developed a replacement for Patriot, which they are offering for sale, but they also have the Iron Dome, which can stop, the rockets and the short range stuff coming across the border, which is a problem the Saudis have down on the Yemen border. And I believe they've already offered that. Said, look, we can sell you, Iron Dome, maybe through a third party, but it's still going to be obviously an Israeli system. But that will stop all that nonsense. And we can also help you, as you've already pointed out, as Austin already pointed out, with the radar systems that can catch and help you intercept the low flying and slow flying, UAVs and even quadcopters with explosives, because they've been dealing with that. In fact, that may have already happened.
I think it has
been much more successful in detecting and shooting down these low altitude, low attacks coming out of Yemen. That hadn't happened before. And of course, they're basically broadcasting that. They're giving the media, gun camera footage of Israeli F-15 shooting down these basically the Iranian version of the Predator, which are loaded up with 100 or so kilograms, a couple 100 pounds of explosives, and sent against targets inside Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis are convinced. Their big problem is a public relations one. How do we basically undo half a century of anti-Israeli propaganda? Well, the answer is carefully. So you can't blame them for that, but at least they're doing it. The UAE is way ahead of that because their people, their population has understood. They'll get out there and say, that to Israel, but not as much as the Saudis or even the Iranians. And it's just in their genes, as it were, in their historical, experience, that we should have the Israelis on our side openly, not just covertly. And that's something that's happening slowly, because they do have a public relations problem within their own countries and explaining, well, why were you wrong for so long? So I mean, they have their own way of handling that. It's their problem. They have to deal with it. So you really can't, tell them. I mean, and indeed, the Israelis are probably advising them there, but the Israelis can also tell them, he says, all that propaganda, it's even got 20% of our population who are Arabs, most of the Muslims, they are anti-Israel, except when it comes to no longer being Israeli. They have this anti-Israel, attitude. But at the same time, one of the things they're most afraid of is losing their Israeli citizenship. So, you can't have it both ways. And I think a lot of the Arabs are realizing that, including the Arab Israelis.
I want to, I was going to.
Yeah, wrap it. So,
all right, let's go. I'll go right
wrap it up for us.
Iran. Jim said, the Israelis have showed some of their cards, but I'll tell you one of the things is that Iran is in such desperate straits. There are a lot of people there who are angry with the regime, and they, I think, maybe not just for money, would turn on them, and the Israelis are prepared to exploit that opportunity should they need to do it. What I just said,
I think they're already doing it.
I think I'm sure you're right. How's that, Dan?
That's great, guys. So, it makes me think that not next time. I'll let people know what we'll be doing next time. We'll be talking more about Jim's tour of wargaming history and talking about Jutland and some of the other things that he's done. But I think in a few weeks we ought to do a tour of what's happening in Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and some of the other countries there in the area with COVID and how they're dealing with conflict in general. So
that'll be
next month for the regular strategy talk, as opposed to the special edition
wargaming
history strategy talk,
right?
Which I think will run about six episodes.
Right. Yep. That's what we're hoping. And we'll talk to you guys next time.
Indeed.
Take care, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.